Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The first time I understood the world had actually ended, I was standing in the shadow of a redwood so wide you couldn't wrap your arms around it with 3 friends. I wasn't there with friends. I was there alone because I didn't do crowds even before the outbreak. I was a wildlife photographer, and if you spend enough years waiting for elk to step out of fog or for a marbled murrelet to cross an opening in the canopy, you get used to silence, patience, and being forgotten. That used to be a choice. After the outbreak, it became a requirement. My name is Harper Sloan. I was living out of a small rental outside Outbreak, California, right near the line where people stop calling it the coast and start calling it the parks. It was close enough to drive the Bald Hills Road when I wanted altitude and light, close enough to duck into Prairie Creek Redwood State Park on a weekday morning, and close enough to disappear for days when the ocean fog made the whole world feel like a darkroom tray. I knew the service trails, the gated roads, and the pullouts tourists didn't notice because they were busy taking pictures of the first big tree they saw. I knew which bridges had good cell service and which ones didn't. I knew where the rangers parked when they needed a quiet break. I knew where the trees grew in tight clusters that swallowed sound. The outbreak did not start with a dramatic siren or some movie moment where the power cuts and everyone screams at once. It started with whispers, bad footage on screens, and then the quiet kind of fear that makes people behave strangely in grocery stores. The first week, I thought it would be like everything else, a headline, a few closures, some overreaction, and then a return to normal. The second week, the highway started to change. On U.S. Route 101, cars were parked crooked on shoulders, hoods up, doors open, like people had climbed out and walked away mid-problem. The third week, there were no more normal radio stations, just static and a few emergency messages that repeated until you could recite them without trying. By the fourth week, the coastal towns went thin and tense, like a place right before a storm, except the storm never moved on. I learned quickly that the biggest danger wasn't the infected. It was the living, the ones who still had enough mind to make plans and enough hunger to do anything. The infected were predictable in an awful way. They moved on stimulus. They gathered on sound. They wandered when there wasn't anything to draw them. They were a threat, always, but a threat that followed rules you could observe. People didn't. People made new rules daily. I lasted the first month in my rental because I already lived like someone who could vanish. I had camping gear, I had water filters, fuel canisters, a 2-burner stove, spare batteries, headlamps with red filters, and the kind of quiet clothing you buy when you've spent too many mornings sounding like a walking potato chip. I had enough dried food to ride out a storm. I had cameras, but after the first week I stopped taking photos. I didn't want proof, I wanted distance. I also had something else, something that mattered more than gear. I had knowledge of where not to go. When the first real wave of panic hit and people started heading for the woods, I did not go where everyone else went. I did not go to the visitor centers because visitor centers are magnets. I did not go to the big trailheads because trailheads become camps, camps become garbage, garbage becomes smell, smell becomes attention. I did not go to the obvious hidden cabins people talk about. I went in the opposite direction. I went to a tree. There's a difference between finding shelter and making one. A tent is shelter until it isn't. A cabin is shelter until someone sees smoke or tracks. A vehicle is shelter until the battery dies or the tires flatten. I needed something that blended into the landscape so completely that it didn't register as a thing to look at. I needed shelter that didn't announce itself at night with light, or in the day with noise, or over time with trash. The best hiding place is the one nobody thinks to check because it doesn't fit the story they have in their head. I found the tree during one of my old scouting loops, a route I'd taken years earlier while chasing a particular Roosevelt elk herd that liked to move between prairies and shadowed creek corridors. It was a massive coast redwood with a long burn scar, the kind you see when lightning strikes or when a fire licks up the trunk and then dies out before it can crown. The scar wasn't a neat line, it was a dark, jagged wound that had healed into thick ridged bark. About chest height, there was a narrow opening that looked like nothing at first glance, just a deeper fold in the scar, shadowed and half covered by ferns. When I stepped closer, I felt the air change. The tree was hollow behind the scar. Not the whole tree, not like a cartoon, but hollow enough that someone could stand inside if they could get in. I didn't carve it out. That mattered to me morally and practically. Morally, because these trees are ancient and the thought of cutting into one for my own survival felt like stealing from something that had outlived everything I knew. Practically, because carving creates fresh wood smell. Fresh debris, fresh marks, and fresh marks are signposts. If anyone ever came looking, fresh marks would say, "Someone has been here recently." I needed the tree to look exactly like a tree that had been struck and scarred and then forgotten. The entry point wasn't the scar opening itself. That was too visible if anyone happened to walk by at the wrong angle. The real entry point was lower and to the side, hidden behind a fallen log that had become its own little ecosystem of moss, fungus, and thick green ferns. The fallen log wasn't placed there by me. It had been there a long time. It created a natural screen, and the ferns made a curtain that moved with the wind, so it never looked arranged. I could part them, slide sideways, and slip into the dark without stepping on anything that would crack loudly. The first time I crawled in, I did it like an animal, slow and listening, because I wasn't sure if I was about to wedge myself into a place I couldn't escape. Inside, the air smelled like damp bark and old smoke trapped in wood. It wasn't a clean smell, but it wasn't rot either. It was stable. The interior space was roughly oval, narrower near the entry and wider deeper in. The floor wasn't dirt. It was a mix of old ash, bark dust, and compacted debris that felt like firm soil. If I turned off my light, I couldn't see my own hands. It was the kind of darkness that makes you aware of your breathing. I sat there for a long time that first day and just listened. I listened for cracking wood, for insects, for any sign the tree was unstable. A hollow tree can be a shelter, but it can also be a trap if the structure is compromised. Redwoods are strange that way. They can survive fire and still stand for centuries, but they can also fail suddenly after a storm. I wasn't going to trust my life to a guess. So I tested gently. I pressed my palms to the inner wall and felt for soft spots. I listened when the wind moved through the canopy. I watched how water moved when the rain came, where it dripped, where it pooled. I checked the ground around the base for signs of recent heaving or cracks. I wasn't a forester, but I'd spent enough time around these trees to know what healthy enough looked like. The tree wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It needed to be more stable than any human structure I could find without stepping into someone else's story. Once I decided the tree was usable, I made a plan that followed one rule above all. Everything had to be removable. No nails driven into living wood, no screws, no cuts. Nothing that left a permanent scar or a fresh smell. If I had to abandon it, I wanted to be able to take my shelter apart and leave behind almost nothing. If I got sick or injured and someone found me, I didn't want the shelter to become a permanent attraction that pulled people in. I wanted it to vanish with me. I drove back to my rental one last time at dawn and loaded my vehicle like I was moving out in a hurry, because I was. The roads were still passable then, though tense. I kept my head down and I didn't stop for anyone. I pulled off to siphon fuel from abandoned cars only once, and I did it with my heart in my throat because the smell of gasoline carries, and the sound of a hose and a jerry can feels loud when the world is listening. I took what I could without making a scene. Then I left the vehicle hidden off a side road under branches, and I walked the last stretch to the tree. The first thing I built was not a bed. It was a floor. Not a floor that covered the ground, but a raised platform that kept me off the damp and away from whatever crawled in the debris. I used a lightweight frame made from scavenged aluminum tubing and hardwood dowels I'd salvaged from a broken camping cot. I wrapped contact points with rubber and cloth to stop squeaks. I used paracord and flat webbing straps to lash the frame together because straps don't creak the way rope can when it shifts under load. The frame pressed gently against the inner walls, distributing pressure without cutting or puncturing. It was basically a freestanding insert, like building a ship inside a bottle without touching the glass. Above that, I hung a sleeping platform, more of a sling than a bed, using climbing-rated webbing and carabiners that I already owned because I'd done enough tree photography to know how useful it is to hang a camera rig or a bear bag. I positioned it so my body weight was supported by the frame, not the tree. I tested it gradually, adding weight in small increments, listening for any sound. I learned quickly where the tree amplified noise. A hollow trunk can act like a drum if you hit it wrong. I lined parts of the interior with dense fabric and foam mats to dampen sound and to prevent my gear from clacking against wood. The second thing I built was the entry management. A hidden shelter is only hidden if you don't leave a trail. That meant no straight paths, no repeated footsteps in one line, no broken ferns that scream human hands. I learned to approach from different angles, sometimes circling wide to come in from the downhill side, sometimes stepping on rocks and logs to minimize ground compression. I brushed out footprints with a simple branch broom I made and kept outside, hidden under the fallen log, so I could erase my own history when I came and went. My third priority was water. In Northern California, water is everywhere until it isn't. The creeks look generous, but they can change fast with rain or with drought. I couldn't rely on one source. I mapped 3 within a reasonable walking distance. A small seep that ran clear even in dry weeks, a creek that flowed year-round in a shaded gulch, and a larger stream farther out that I could use if I needed volume. I carried water in collapsible bladders and lightweight bottles, and I treated everything. I used a gravity filter when I had time and iodine tablets as backup. I also boiled water sometimes, but boiling meant heat, and heat meant risk. I never boiled inside the tree. Fire was a decision I made once and then kept making every day. No smoke, that was my rule. Smoke is a beacon. Even if you think you're deep enough in the woods, smoke rises and it carries on the wind. People can smell it. Dogs can smell it. Drones can see heat differences if they're equipped well enough, and even a cheap camera can spot a smoke thread in still air. I had a small stove, but I used it only in the open, under heavy canopy, and only when conditions were right. Misty mornings, rain days, times when fog sat low and would swallow anything I did. Most days, I ate cold food, or food I could hydrate without cooking, or things I could dry and chew. It wasn't comfortable, it was safe. For hunting, I did not want a firearm. Not because I didn't respect them. I did. I'd grown up around people who hunted, and I understood what a rifle can do. But a gunshot in the Redwoods is not just a sound, it's an announcement. Sound carries in the forest like it was designed to travel. The trunks and the fog and the open corridors between trees can turn a single shot into a message that bounces for miles. I needed silence. I also needed a tool I could maintain without a supply chain. So I used a small bow. Not a big compound bow that needs specialized parts and a press if something goes wrong. A compact recurve bow I'd bought years earlier for quiet practice and for the simple satisfaction of learning a skill that didn't involve batteries. It wasn't powerful like a hunting setup meant for larger game at distance, and I wasn't going after big game anyway because big game is work, and work leaves evidence. I practiced with it far from my shelter, deep in a noisy area near a small cascade where the water covered sound. I learned what it could and couldn't do. It was enough for small animals, and I was careful about what I attempted. Hunger makes you greedy. Greed makes you sloppy. Sloppy gets you noticed. My daily routine formed the way routines always do, by necessity. Wake before dawn. Listen. Wait, check the entry area without stepping outside, using a small mirror on a telescoping handle to look around the fallen log without showing my face. Smell the air. Sound was important, but smell mattered too. If I ever caught the scent of smoke, gasoline, sweat, or dogs, I would freeze and reassess. Then I would do water if I needed it. Early, when wind was low and animals were active and less likely to notice me as unusual movement. Then I would check my food stores and decide if I needed to forage or hunt. Then I would spend the middle of the day inside, because daylight is when humans move. Inside the tree, I kept things organized because chaos is loud. When you're hungry and tired, you drop things. When you drop things, they clack. When they clack, you panic. Panic makes noise. I had a small light with a red mode that I used sparingly. I used a blackout curtain inside the entry so no light leaked out through cracks. I kept my gear tethered or padded. I wrapped metal objects in cloth. I made soft parking spots for everything. Bow, arrows, knife, water bladder, medical kit. I learned to move like I was on a boat at night, one hand always knowing where the next hold was. I kept no trash piles, nothing outside, nothing that could attract animals or mark my presence. Everything organic was buried far away, in small amounts and scattered. Everything non-organic was carried and hidden in separate caches, not near my tree because if someone found one cache, I didn't want them to find my home. I used odor-resistant bags where I could. I washed myself in small ways, never fully clean, but clean enough to avoid infection and to keep from smelling like a person who had stopped trying. Scent is a signature, and in a world with dogs, scent is a danger. The infected were present in the parks, but not in the way people imagine when they picture cities overrun. The redwoods swallowed them. They wandered along roads and trails, following the easiest paths, because even in death or sickness or whatever this was, humans still moved the way humans used to. Sometimes I saw one standing in a clearing, still as a stump, head tilted, like it was listening to a sound that wasn't there. Sometimes I saw a cluster near an old picnic area, drawn by the echoes of some earlier chaos. More often, I heard them before I saw them, a faint, irregular shuffling, a breathy vocalization. A twig snapped without the careful weight shift an animal makes. I learned to respect the infected the way you respect a wildfire. You don't argue with it. You don't assume you can outsmart it at the last second. You watch the wind and you don't put yourself where you'll have to sprint. I moved only when I could move quietly. I never ran unless I was already discovered because running is the loudest thing a human can do in a forest. For months, the tree worked. It worked because I treated Undetected like a job, not a status. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't relax into it. I didn't start thinking of the tree as a home that would always be there. I thought of it as a temporary advantage. I earned that advantage every day by not taking shortcuts. I marked time in small ways. Notches on a strip of cloth not carved into wood. Weather patterns. The shift of bird calls. The way the fog lifted later and later as summer warmed. The first time I heard distant gunfire from somewhere beyond the park boundary, I realized the rest of the world hadn't gone quiet. It had simply moved to different rhythms. People were still out there, making noise, making decisions, and those decisions would eventually ripple into the forest. The first time I met another living human after I moved into the tree, it wasn't face-to-face. It was evidence. I found a boot print near one of my water sources. Deep tread, heavy, the kind of print you get from someone carrying a load. It was fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened. I froze, water bladder in hand, and stared at it like it was a snake. I didn't move forward. I didn't move backward fast. I just listened. I couldn't hear anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there. People in the woods can be closer than you think. I backed out, slow, stepping on the same rocks I'd used to approach, and I returned to the tree without collecting water. That day, I rationed instead. I drank less, and I ate salty food, and I hated myself for it, but I didn't risk being caught at a predictable spot. That boot print changed my routine. It meant someone else had a map. It meant I wasn't the only one who understood that the parks held resources, cover, and isolation. Over the next week, I found more signs. A snapped branch at waist height, cleanly broken, not the ragged tear a deer makes. A small pile of ash under a rock overhang, carefully scattered but still there. A length of bright plastic tape tied high on a branch, the kind hikers use for marking a route temporarily, except this wasn't a hiking trail. Someone was moving through the forest with intent. I told myself it could be a ranger. It could be someone trying to survive quietly like me. But the longer I watched, the more I saw the pattern. They were sweeping. They moved in arcs, like people who understood coverage. They checked likely hiding places. They seemed to return to certain points like they were mapping a grid. That wasn't random survival wandering. That was a search. The scavengers arrived in my life before I ever saw their faces. I heard them first, not voices. Voices can be carried on the wind and mistaken for birds or distant water if you want to lie to yourself. I heard equipment. A faint mechanical whine high above the canopy that didn't belong to any insect. I heard it on a day with clear air and little wind, and it made my stomach turn cold because I knew what it was. A drone. I'd used drones before for photography assignments where a client wanted an establishing shot of a landscape. I knew the sound, the small, persistent buzz that doesn't fit the forest. I also knew how far that sound can travel when there's no highway noise to drown it out. The drone was not close enough for me to see, but it was close enough to be sweeping. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my hanging platform with my bow beside me and my hand on an arrow like it was a comfort object. Shooting a drone with a bow is not realistic in dense canopy unless it's low and slow and you get lucky. The sound alone doesn't tell you where it is. I didn't plan to shoot it. I planned to not exist. The next morning, I heard dogs. Not coyotes. Not the sharp, wild yips of a pack. These were domestic dogs, trained, or at least directed, moving with humans. You can tell by how their barks happen in bursts and then stop, as if they're checking in. You can tell by the way the sound shifts along a line, as if a person is walking with them. My throat went dry. Dogs don't search like people, and they don't get bored the same way. If a dog caught my scent near the entry, it wouldn't matter how good my hiding spot was. The dog would lead them right to the fallen log and the ferns and the crack of darkness that I called safety. I had prepared for this possibility in a general way, but there's a difference between planning and hearing it happen. I'd stored certain items in separate caches. food, water treatment, a spare light, some basic medical supplies, a small amount of fuel for emergencies. Each cache was far enough away that someone finding one wouldn't automatically lead them to the tree. The tree was my main shelter, but I'd promised myself I would never let it become my only option. I also had scent control strategies that were simple but effective. I kept my waste managed. I never cooked inside. I used natural scent cover when I could. Wet earth, crushed conifer needles, the kind of forest smells that dominate after rain. But dogs are dogs. They don't care about what smells normal to humans. They care about what smells like a person. When the dogs were close enough that I could hear their breathing between barks, I made a decision that hurt. I left. Not permanently, not yet, but I left the tree before the search line reached it. I moved while the wind was shifting, because wind direction matters when dogs are involved. I moved downhill first, because scent tends to pool and move differently in gullies, and I wanted to complicate the trail. I moved through water where I could, stepping in shallow sections of creek to break scent. I used rocks and logs. I avoided soft soil. I didn't run. I didn't hurry in a way that would make noise. I moved like someone trying to be boring. I went to one of my caches and waited in a natural depression under thick understory, a place where I could see without being seen. I lay there for hours, listening as the searchline passed somewhere above me. The drone buzz came and went. The dogs barked, then stopped, then barked again. Every time the barking changed tone, my heart punched against my ribs. I kept my mouth slightly open to breathe quietly, because breathing through your nose when you're stressed makes noise you don't notice until it matters. They didn't find me that day. I know because I didn't hear the sudden cluster of voices and excitement that would come with a discovery. I didn't hear the frantic barking that happens when a dog locks onto something close. I heard steady movement, methodical, patient. That was worse in some ways, because it meant that they weren't desperate amateurs. They were organized. When the forest finally went quiet again, I waited longer. In the old world, waiting after something passes is something you do to photograph wildlife. In the new world, waiting after something passes is how you stay alive. I didn't return to the tree until night, and even then I didn't go straight there. I circled, approached from a different angle, and checked for new disturbances. In the darkness, the fallen log looked the same. The ferns looked the same, but looks the same isn't proof. Inside, everything was exactly where I left it. No shifted padding, no disturbed dust, no scent of chudgy liudi, no human smell that didn't belong to me. That was a relief, but it didn't solve the problem, it confirmed it. They were searching the parks, they had drones and dogs, and they would come back. I started watching them deliberately. I didn't have binoculars, but I had a long telephoto lens, and in the right light, it worked like a spyglass. I found a vantage point high on a slope where I could see a stretch of old road through gaps in the canopy. Over several days, I caught glimpses. People moving in twos and threes, wearing mismatched gear, carrying packs that looked heavy. One had a radio clipped to his shoulder strap. One had a dog on a long lead. One wore a brimmed hat with something reflective taped to it, maybe to signal the drone operator or to keep the drone from confusing them with something else. They didn't look like desperate tourists. They looked like people who decided the world was theirs if they were willing to take it. I recognized that look, not from personal experience, but from enough time around certain kinds of people in remote areas, the ones who talk about the coming collapse, like it's a hobby, and who always seem weirdly excited about hardship. These weren't hikers caught in disaster. These were scavengers by choice. I needed to know what they wanted. Were they looking for food caches? Were they hunting people? Were they clearing the parks because they planned to establish territory? The answer mattered because it determined how long I could keep playing this game of invisibility. If they were simply looting and moving on, I could outlast them. If they were building a system, then I was living inside their future map. The clue came from something small. I found a marker, an unnatural arrangement of sticks angled in a way that looked deliberate. It was near a game trail. At first, I thought it might be some old ranger sign, but it wasn't. It was new. And when I found a second marker a half-mile away, I understood. They were mapping search coverage. They were marking cleared zones, points of interest, maybe caches they'd found, maybe suspected hideouts. They were doing what I'd been doing privately, but with a team. I realized then that my tree was not safe long-term. Not because it was obvious, but because it was in a region of the forest that would eventually be swept if they kept expanding. Undetected wasn't permanent. It was something I earned daily with discipline, and discipline wasn't enough if someone else was willing to put in more work than I could. I started preparing for a move, not a dramatic evacuation, not a panicked flight. A controlled shift. I began by reducing my footprint even further. I stopped using my closest water sources. I began pulling supplies from caches farther away, accepting the risk of longer travel in exchange for less predictability. I also moved some of my gear out of the tree at night and distributed it. Small loads. Nothing that looked like a person-moving house. If someone stumbled upon my tree when I wasn't there, I wanted it to look less like a stocked shelter and more like an empty hollow. I also changed my hunting behavior. I hunted less and foraged more, because hunting involves patterns. Even if I was quiet, I still had to travel to places where animals were. Animals have their own patterns, and if scavengers were sweeping, they might watch those areas too. I learned to eat what the forest offered in safer ways. Berries when I could. Edible greens. Mushrooms only when I was absolutely certain, because guessing wrong in a world without hospitals is a slow death. I relied on stored food more than I liked, and I rationed hard. The scavengers made their first direct move against my area without knowing I existed. I know because I heard it. The distinctive snap of a branch being forced, followed by voices, low and controlled. They were checking hollows. Not my hollow yet, but others. The forest around me had older burned trunks too, smaller cavities in dead wood, places a desperate person might crawl into. They were being thorough. I stayed inside the tree that day, still as a fungus, and listened as they moved closer. I could hear a dog's tags, faintly sometimes, a soft metallic clink that told me the dog wasn't fully stripped of noise. That meant the humans weren't perfect. That meant they weren't military or professional search and rescue. They were organized amateurs. Still dangerous, but not flawless. At one point, the drone buzz returned and seemed to hover. The sound changed pitch slightly, like it was holding position. I held my breath and pressed myself against the inner wall where the tree's thickness was greatest, not because I believed the drone could hear my breathing, but because the instinct to become part of the wood is hard to fight. I turned off my light and waited. Nothing happened. The drone moved on. The voices faded. The dog barked once, then stopped. I didn't move for another hour. When I finally allowed myself to exhale fully, it felt like my chest had been locked in place. That night, I made a decision that I'd been avoiding because it felt like surrender. I would not wait for them to find me. I would move before their pattern intersected my hiding spot. That meant giving up a shelter that had protected me for months. It meant risking travel through a world full of infected inhumans. It meant stepping back into uncertainty. But staying put was no longer safe. Staying put was simply familiar. Familiarity is how people die in changing environments. I chose my next shelter the same way I chose the tree, not by picking the most comfortable option, but by picking the least obvious one. I needed something that wasn't on a typical search list. Scavengers check cabins, vehicles, sheds, culverts, caves, and hollows. They check anything that looks like a human idea of shelter. I needed something that looked like nothing. In the Redwoods, nothing can be dense. Sometimes it's just a tangle of fallen logs and sword ferns where the ground is uneven and wet and no one wants to crawl. Sometimes it's a thicket near a creek that smells like mud. Sometimes it's a steep slope where footing is bad and visibility is worse. Those places aren't comfortable, but comfort isn't the goal. The goal is to be overlooked. I also had a more aggressive option: misdirection. If they were sweeping for hidden people and caches, then feeding them a false trail could buy me time. That idea made my skin crawl because it felt like stepping into a predator role. But survival changes what you're willing to do. It doesn't make you a different person overnight. It just reveals what you'll accept when the alternative is being found by people who don't intend to leave you alive and well. I planned the misdirection carefully. I created a small cache far from my tree, something valuable enough to attract attention, but not so valuable that I couldn't afford to lose it. A few sealed food packets, an old battery pack, a small knife I could spare. I placed it in a spot that looked like a desperate hiding place, not a deliberate one, and I made sure there were tracks leading to it. Tracks that looked clumsy, like someone inexperienced. I used a stick to scuff the ground in a way that suggested panic. I left a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It felt theatrical, and that was the point. People trust stories more than they trust reality. Then I waited. Not near the fake cache, too risky, but from a distance where I could observe the general area. It took 2 days, but it worked. I heard voices and saw movement. Through my lens, I watched them find it. One person crouched, examined the ground, looked around like he expected an ambush. Another whistled softly to the dog, who pulled toward the spot. They dug up the small stash. They didn't celebrate. They didn't relax. They talked briefly, pointing, scanning, then moved on. But I saw what I needed to see. They believed the story. They believed someone had been there recently, and that someone had moved away from that point. That bought me space. Maybe a week, maybe less. In that window, I dismantled my life inside the tree. I did it slowly over several nights, carrying out pieces of the removable frame, the sleeping sling, the padding, the small comforts that had made it livable. I left behind as little as possible. I cleaned surfaces gently with a brush and cloth, not to erase everything. Erasing everything can look suspicious too, but to reduce obvious signs. I restored the entry area to its natural state. I made the ferns lie the way they wanted to lie. I placed the fallen log screen exactly how it had been, down to small bits of moss. I took a last long look at the burn scar from a distance and tried to see it through a stranger's eyes. It looked like a tree. That was the best compliment I could give my own work. I didn't feel relief when I left. I felt grief. Not for the shelter itself, but for what it represented. A world where I'd managed to live quietly on my own terms. Leaving meant admitting that even the forest could be colonized by other people's desperation and greed. It meant accepting that no place stays hidden once enough humans start looking. I moved north and inland in small stages, avoiding roads. I used old knowledge, where the ground stayed wet and silent, where the ferns grew thick, where the canopy muffled the moonlight. I kept my bow, but kept it buried in cloth. I didn't want to look like someone ready for a fight. I wanted to look like nothing. I traveled at dawn and dusk, resting during full daylight. I drank from safer sources and treated everything. I slept in miserable places, under root tangles, between logs, in depressions that filled with cold, damp air. Each time I found myself thinking, I should just go back to the tree, I reminded myself. The tree was safe because I was unknown. I am not unknown anymore. Not to them. Not to the idea of me. The scavengers did not chase me directly. They didn't need to. Their search patterns were the chase. Their dogs and drones were the chase. The park itself was the chase, because it funneled movement and forced choices. I had to stay ahead of where they would search next, and that meant thinking like them without becoming them. I had to predict what they believed. They believed people hid near water, so I avoided obvious water. They believed people hid near roads because roads are access, so I avoided roads. They believed people hid in cabins and vehicles, so I avoided anything that looked like a human structure. They believed people liked comfort, so I chose discomfort as camouflage. One evening, days after I'd abandoned the tree, I heard them again. Dogs, farther away, and the faint buzz of a drone above the canopy. My chest tightened, but the sound was distant enough that I could choose. I could freeze and let them pass, or I could move and risk creating noise. The wind was steady in my favor, blowing my scent away from them. I froze. I lay in a patch of wet sword ferns and let the damp soak through my clothes. I let mosquitoes bite me. I let my muscles cramp. I became a piece of ground. They passed, and as they did, I heard something that changed my understanding of them. I heard a short, sharp whistle, followed by a spoken phrase, low but clear enough that I caught part of it. Market. We'll come back. They were not just searching randomly. They were cataloging. They were building a system. That was the moment I stopped thinking of them as a temporary problem. They were a new kind of predator, one that could outlast seasons because it wasn't hungry in the same way. They were hungry for control. They were hungry for territory. And territory is something people fight over longer than they fight over food. I knew then that my best chance wasn't to keep running forever inside the parks. The parks were a resource, and resources attract organized groups. My best chance was to become uninteresting, to move to places that didn't offer the kind of easy cover and romantic wilderness survival fantasy people chased. The redwoods were beautiful, and beauty draws people even after the world collapses. I needed uglier edges, transitional zones, places where the forest gives way to scrub, places where the wind is harsher and the ground is less forgiving, places where the infected might be more visible, but the humans would be less eager to linger. I also knew I couldn't stay alone forever. That thought didn't come from loneliness, it came from math. One person can be disciplined, but one person gets sick. One person gets injured, one person has to sleep, and sleeping is vulnerability. The scavengers had teams. They had dogs. They had drones. They had redundancy. My discipline was strong, but discipline doesn't replace a second set of eyes. The first real contact I made was accidental, and it almost got me killed. I was moving along a shallow ravine when I saw a shape ahead that didn't fit the landscape. It wasn't an infected. The posture was wrong. It wasn't an animal either, too still. I froze behind a stump and raised my lens as if it was a scope, because in that moment the habit of photography served as reconnaissance. The figure shifted slightly, and I saw a flash of a reflective patch, then a hand signal. Someone else was there. They had seen me. I didn't reach for my bow. I raised my empty hand slowly, palms out, and stepped into a more open patch so they could see I wasn't trying to flank. That's a gamble. In the new world, showing yourself is offering someone an opportunity. But hiding when someone already knows you're there can trigger the worst reaction. People shoot at what they can't see because they imagine the unseen as a threat. I chose visibility to reduce imagination. A voice came from the brush, calm but firm. "Stop. Don't come closer." It was a man's voice, tired, not excited. That mattered. Excited voices are dangerous. Calm voices are still dangerous, but they suggest thinking. I stopped. I nodded once. "Okay," I said. My throat was dry. "I'm stopping." Another figure stepped out. A woman, mid-30s maybe, with a pack and a long stick that turned out to be a walking staff with something taped near the top. Possibly a makeshift spear point or just reinforcement. Her clothes were practical, dirty but not ragged. She looked at me like she was measuring. "You alone?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Then I added, because honesty without context can be suspicious, I'm trying to stay that way. I'm not looking for trouble." The man appeared next, older than her, with a small pistol held low, not aimed, but ready. He didn't wave it around. That restraint mattered too. "Everyone says that," he said. His eyes flicked to my hands, then to my pack, then to my face. "Name?" "Harper," I said. "Harper Sloan." I didn't give last names often anymore, but he'd asked, and people who ask for names sometimes care about humanity. Sometimes. He nodded once like he was filing it away. "I'm Dale. This is Marisol." The woman gave a small nod. They didn't step closer. The distance stayed. That meant they were cautious. Good. Cautious people survive longer. I didn't tell them about the tree, not yet. That wasn't something you share. A shelter is a secret, and secrets are currency. But I did tell them the important part. There were scavengers sweeping with dogs and drones. I watched their faces change in small ways when I said it. Dale's jaw tightened. Marisol's eyes narrowed as if she'd already suspected. "We've seen signs," Marisol said. "Didn't know about drones." "Yeah," I said. "They still have battery life. They're managing it." That was a guess, but a reasonable one. Battery management is the kind of thing organized groups do. Dale exhaled slowly. "That means they're not starving," he said, "or they wouldn't waste time on toys." "They're not toys," I said, and then immediately wished I hadn't sounded sharp. I softened my tone. "Not out here." Marisol studied me for a long moment. "You've been surviving in the parks a while," she said, not as a question. "Months," I admitted. "Quiet, hidden, until it stopped being quiet." They didn't invite me with them right away. They asked questions first. Where I'd been, what I'd seen, how I managed water. I answered carefully, giving useful information without giving away my deepest knowledge. They responded in kind, telling me enough to show they weren't immediately predatory. They were part of a small group, they said, not far away, living in a place they didn't describe in detail. They'd lost people on the roads. They'd come into the forest to avoid the infected density near towns and to avoid violent groups on the highway. They'd thought the parks would be a buffer. "The parks are a magnet now," I said. "Everyone who thinks wilderness is safe comes here. The infected wander in. The scavengers follow the survivors. It's like layers." Dale looked at the trees above us and then back at me. "You got a plan?" he asked. I almost said no, because the truth was my plan had been a tree and that plan was over. But I didn't want to sound like someone drifting. Drifters attract either pity or exploitation. Instead, I said what I believed. My plan is to stay uninteresting, and I'm starting to think I can't do that alone anymore. Marisol's expression softened just a fraction. "We're not saints," she said, "but we're not out here hunting people. We're trying to outlast." I nodded. Same. They offered me a compromise. Travel with them for a day, keep distance, share information. If either side felt wrong, we'd separate. It wasn't trust, it was a test. I agreed because tests are better than ambushes. That day changed my understanding of survival again. Alone, everything is about controlling your footprint. With other people, everything becomes negotiation. Of noise, of pace, of decisions. Dale moved slowly because of an old knee injury. Marisol moved like someone who'd done hard work for years, steady and efficient. They had one dog, but not a loud one. A medium-sized mutt, lean, with alert eyes. The dog was trained enough to stay close and quiet. That alone told me they were serious. At dusk, they led me to their group's shelter. It wasn't in a tree, it wasn't in a cabin. It was in a place I would have avoided because it looked too exposed. An old maintenance area near a back road, with a small storage building partially collapsed and overgrown. From a distance, it looked like junk. Up close, it was cleverly used. They'd reinforced parts of it with salvaged materials, camouflaged the entry with brush, and built internal partitions that didn't show light. They had a small water catch system that fed into covered containers. No smoke, minimal scent. They'd learned the same lessons I had, just in a different structure. There were 4 more people. 2 younger men, both quiet and wary, and an older woman who watched me with the kind of sharp eyes that have seen betrayal. A teenager sat near the back, not speaking, hands busy with something, twisting cord maybe, or repairing a strap. The group didn't welcome me warmly. Warmth is expensive. But they didn't point weapons at me either. They watched, assessed, and waited for Dale and Marisol to explain. I spent that night in a corner, not fully sleeping. In the early hours, I heard something outside that snapped me awake. The distant buzz of a drone. Faint, but real. The group stirred. Dale muttered under his breath. Marisol cursed quietly, like someone who hates being proven right. They didn't panic. They did something better. They executed a routine. Lights off. Everyone still. Dog controlled. One person moved to a small observation gap and watched without silhouette. The drone sound passed, then returned, closer. The pitch changed as if it was descending slightly. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my teeth. I pictured my old tree, the safety of being inside living wood, and I realized nowhere is truly safe now. Not if someone is committed to finding you. When dawn came, the group decided to move. Not because they'd been found for sure, but because they understood the principle I'd learned. Undetected isn't permanent. You don't wait for proof. You move when the risk curve starts rising. They packed quickly, silently, with practiced motions. Their shelter was designed for that. It could be abandoned without leaving obvious signs. It wasn't a home, it was a stage. As we moved out, Marisol walked beside me for a moment. "You had a good spot," she said quietly, as if she could sense what I'd lost without me telling her. "Yeah," I said, "it was a tree." She looked at me, surprised. "A tree?" "A hollow," I said. "Burn scar. Big enough to stand in, removable frame. Quiet. I didn't give location. I didn't give details. I just gave the concept, and I watched her face as she processed it. "That's smart," she said. There was respect in her voice. Also, risky now. I know, I said. That's why I left. We moved deeper into terrain that was harder for dogs to work. More rock, more water crossings, more wind. The group planned routes that broke scent lines, that avoided obvious funnels, that used natural noise cover like creeks and wind corridors. They were doing what I'd done alone, but with more capability. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't friendly, it was effective. Over the next weeks, I became part of their system, and they became part of mine. I taught them what I knew about the parks, where the service trails actually went, which ridges gave visibility, where elk trails cut through, in ways that bypassed human paths. They taught me what I'd avoided learning, how groups defend themselves, how to set simple early warning lines without leaving obvious signs, how to manage noise discipline with more than one body. The teenager, whose name was Kira, turned out to be the most observant of all. She could spot disturbances in leaf litter like it was a language. The scavengers remained a shadow on the edge of everything. Sometimes we saw their markers. Sometimes we heard their dogs. Once we saw them directly from a distance, a line of people moving along a ridge, drone overhead, dog working below. They looked like they owned the place. That arrogance was dangerous, but it also created predictability. They assumed fear would freeze people. They assumed everyone would either run blindly or hide in obvious holes. They didn't assume a small group could move like a quiet animal pack and choose terrain that made technology less useful. We didn't fight them head-on. That would have been suicide. We avoided, misdirected, and outpaced. We left false signs sometimes, scuffed ground, a dropped wrapper, a deliberately visible old camp spot to pull their sweep away from our real routes. It was ugly work in a moral sense because it meant potentially drawing danger toward someone else. We were careful not to do it near places we suspected other survivors might be. We aimed our misdirection into dead zones, areas with infected density, steep ravines, places with no resources. We tried to steer the scavengers toward wasted effort. In late summer, we found evidence that confirmed what I'd feared. The scavengers weren't just looting, they were building a network. We stumbled upon a hidden supply point that wasn't ours. Plastic bins buried under ferns, carefully sealed, with organized contents. Batteries, packaged food, medical supplies, even spare drone propellers. That kind of cash doesn't exist unless someone is planning to operate long-term. They were turning the parks into their storehouse. They were investing. The group debated what to do, leave it and move on. Take some and risk leaving signs. Destroy it and risk provoking retaliation if they noticed. We chose a fourth option, one that felt like surgery. We took a small portion, just enough to help us, and we replaced it with weight-matched natural material so the bins didn't look disturbed at first glance. We didn't want them to notice quickly. We wanted their confidence to remain high while we gained a little advantage. Among the items we found was a small notebook and a waterproof bag. Not a diary, but a list, grid references and a crude local system, like someone had been mapping points. It wasn't a full map, but it was enough to show that they had a pattern and a plan. Dale stared at it for a long time and then said something that stuck with me. "They're not just surviving," he said. "They're doing business." Business meant negotiation or conflict. We were not in a position to negotiate, not as a small, quiet group with no larger backing. Conflict would come eventually because territory systems always collide. The question was whether we could avoid being the collision point. The outbreak taught me that survival is not a single clever idea. It's a series of choices layered over time. The tree had been a brilliant idea for the first phase, when chaos was loud, when most people were on roads, when the infected were newly scattered and humans hadn't organized into patterns yet. For months, that tree kept me alive. But the world changed around it. Humans adapted. Scavengers organized. Tools like dogs and drones turned the forest from infinite hiding space into a grid that could be worked. Now, my survival depended on something less romantic and more real. Constant movement when needed, constant discipline, and other people who understood the same rules. The ancient tree didn't fail me. Time did. Not calendar time, but the time it takes for threats to evolve. Sometimes, on certain foggy mornings, I still think about that hollow. I picture the burn scar and the dark interior and the way the tree smelled like old smoke and rain. I wonder if it's still empty, if someone else found it, if the scavengers ever marked it on their map. I wonder if the tree will outlast all of us the way it outlasted every fire that scarred it. And then I stop wondering, because wondering is a luxury. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.